Welcome everybody. Welcome you to our webinar this evening, followed by a short AGM. I'm speaking to you from Darkinjung country, where I'm using the reliable internet this evening. It's also a country of where I live, my home. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which we live and work, and we pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. All of us at BirdLife are recognised and are grateful for the immense contribution of all Indigenous people to the knowledge and conservation of our beautiful Australian birds. So again, thank you for joining us. Our webinar this evening, our topic is Wetlands Action for People and Nature, which is the theme for World Wetlands Day in February this year. Sort of ironic. We're a country of drought and flooding rains. Just outside my home at the moment, it's still boggy right underfoot, but wetlands are so important. Wetlands action for people and nature. Our first speaker is Tim Hosking from Dubbo. And Tim is the New South Wales Environmental Water Manager for Macquarie Catchment, and he works for the New South Wales Department of Planning and Environment. He's going to talk about the amazing spring-summer 2021-22 nesting event in the Macquarie Marshes. Can you imagine? It's over 75,000 nests of ibis, egrets, herons, cormorants and darters. Imagine counting them. So that was the largest colonial water breeding event since 2010. Tim's also going to speak about the actions of the New South Wales and Commonwealth Government, their ways to assist these birds. So thank you, Tim. Tim will give his presentation. There'll be a short time for questions afterwards. You can address your questions in the questions section on your screen. If we can't answer them this evening, we'll answer them in e-news or in an email to all our members. So thank you, Tim. I welcome you. I'm relying on Aaron to be the MC of working all this stuff. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Judy, and thanks, Aaron, for sorting me out to get along here tonight. I'm just going to share my screen here, and hopefully that's going to work okay. See that okay?
I can, yes.
Yep, that's good, Tim.
That's the first trick. So Tim Hosking from Wiradjuri country, Dubbo. I'm going to be talking about the Macquarie Marshes, which is Wailwan country, to my sort of 2 hours to my north and west. I've got the great job of trying to look after a place like the Macquarie Marshes. I spend a lot of time in water management, but also, working with landholders, doing all sorts of, trying to inform state policies and things where I can to keep a place like the marshes prospering. As a birdo, of course, that's a great pleasure because I get to see the direct results of some of the work that I do, and I'm going to share a bit of it with you today. Summer of 21, so I'm going to just reflect upon what's just happened within the last few months within the Macquarie Marshes wetland system. Just let me get this. Yep. Taking us one step back, why I'm around is one of the reasons I'm around is to implement the basin plan. So it's set at a Commonwealth level. In 2012 that came into being, but around 2009 it was sort of commenced. They started making it. And I guess they said, looked at, say, the Richie Kingsford aerial flown data. This is the University of New South Wales stuff up until 2009. And, that's my line of best fit, not theirs. But they basically said, well, if there's this decline in waterbirds, amongst other wetland critters, they use native fish and vegetation and a few other things as well. We want to make an intervention here to try and maybe stabilise and grow the waterbird populations that we're finding in the Murray-Darling Basin. So put us into that green patch rather than the purple patch that I've highlighted there in red. So a bunch of water returning from human use back to the environment. And that's a big part of my job is managing the water that was returned back to the environment of the Macquarie catchment where I live. And I guess, that's the sort of data that we're seeing since the recovery, the basin plan came in. So whether I'm doing a good job or not, I guess I'll leave that to you to decide. But we have had a few massive droughts since 2009 to make life interesting for me and the birds and other environmental water managers around the place. So this is my patch, the Macquarie catchment. The marshes are in the sort of central north of the state. For those who haven't been there, we're fed by good rains in the upper catchment, Orange, Oberon, Bathurst, Coolar Tops sort of areas. There's a couple of big dams in the way of that water getting down the river, and that's harnessed for human use, and about a third of it is run for the environment in this catchment, which I help manage for a place like the Macquarie Marshes towards the end of the catchment. And the water is flowing at the moment through the marshes and into the Barwon River beyond, making it through to Brewarrina and beyond down to Menindee. And we track the water as we go. We've got all sorts of technology and science behind what we do. Here's just a few snapshots of the growing area of inundation through this 200,000 hectare area. Middle of the year, it sort of started at 20,000, a relic of last, the summer of 2020, growing over October, and then we had a big flood here in December, and so 135,000 hectares was counted in December 2021. When we think about colonial birds, I guess those sorts of species that only really nest in big mobs, they started turning up in around October, and a few of them did start to nest, but it wasn't until December where they really kicked in. So we had most of the colonies that were present in October, November here in the marshes double in size over December. So Christmas, big influx of birds, and then we've been watching them nest through the last few months and trying to manage some of the dam spilling water for the environment. So our dams are spilling here still. There's still 110% is Burrendong Dam, so it's still spilling, and we've been able to tailor some of those spills to actually help the birds. And the sorts of things we get, and I'll talk about that, I guess. So we're talking about a range of these colonial bird species, mainly the egrets, night herons, ibis, and a few others, which I'll get to in a minute. But they start to shack up in these big colonies, 10 to 40,000 nests in size. Here's a few. This is a couple of royal spoonbills, but also mostly intermediate egrets in River Coober in the marshes. And so when we start to see this happening, we kick into a lot of monitoring to see what's going on and monitor the water, so that we're keeping water up around their nesting grounds, their colonies, but also within their foraging grounds, because they need a lot of food to support so many birds. Tons and tons of bird food gets chewed up each day and brought back to young birds. So keeping the foraging grounds wetted, hundreds of thousands of hectares, or 100,000 hectares, say, over the last couple of months has been part of our job. We use a lot of stuff to get near those places. They nest a long way away from where anybody can comfortably get to. You got to quad bike, sometimes just walk, in through waist deep water or more. Kayaking and choppers are quite frequently deployed to make those counts. They are quite difficult, and I guess because they're so remote and because they're so special, these colonies, we don't tend to have many other visiting birdos. So for some things around the birding world, there is data generated by community birdos, which is great, through bird data and things. But in this case, we really don't want, apart from say the landholders or whoever they invite, for example, best not to have people roaming around these colonies, because they're quite prone to disturbance. Apart from being remote, just even getting there is tricky. So we want to kind of keep them private, let them do their thing. They're so rare and special that we take a lot of time and effort to minimize our impact and keep them that way. If you ever get the chance, certainly take it. But for most of us, when I'm not doing this job, it'll be people going in who can try and tell the story back out to the wide world. And hence one of my reasons for being here today, to let you know what's sort of happening out there, because these colonies have a real bearing on the birds we see around our wetlands, even coastal folks. So the ibis, so they're either stomping down these big reed beds. So those reed beds, 2-3 meters tall. They'll stomp them down to nests, or they're laying on lignum bushes. So stomp the lignum bushes down. You want to have at least a meter of water kind of thing under the lignum bushes. So depth of water is important to discourage pigs and things like that. And then they'll nest. And so mostly in the marshes case, and even throughout the Murray-Darling Basin, it's straw-necked ibis. So they're our biggest numbers, with a few glossies that come and nest. They have a shorter nesting time, so they'll kind of wait for the glossies to get set up, and then they'll go and nest and leave before the glossies are done. And a few white ibis as well, and they'll start earlier often, and maybe do 2 batches to have 2 sets of youngs, whereas the straw necks might only have 1 set, and in this case they only had 1 set of young. The other main group of colonies that we have are egret and night heron colonies. So in the marshes case, it's 80% intermediate egrets normally, but this year it's been maybe 50% intermediate egrets, but a lot more night herons this year, interestingly. So I don't know, maybe 30-40% night herons by number. I'm rounding. So you get the adult intermediate egrets, like the ones in the top right there, with their pinky and sort of greenish bluey color face, and when they're breeding, spectacular colors. And the youngsters over on the top left with their yellow bills, and they're a big proportion of night herons with their ornate nests. Actually put a lot more effort into their nest than these egrets do. They're basically not much more than a pigeon's nest, but the night herons really do. You can see in the background of that picture there with the night herons, that's one of their nests. Put in a lot of effort, and they nest around the fringes of the egrets. They're kind of they're pushed out. They're not well liked for some reason. Predation could be part of it. There is a few great egrets around in the bottom left, and a few of the cormorants. There's a set of young there in the middle bottom, also nest with the egrets. And so these guys are up in trees. A lot of red gum, a lot of these river kuba, which are in acacia in the floodplain. And I guess some other characters, the spoonbills are amongst them, particularly the royals. In our case, the yellowbills are in much lower numbers. You can see the density of the ibis nests there. High density living. They're right next to each other. In these big areas, there's some young ibis, sort of recently fledged. We call those flyers. They'll hang around the nest, getting mum and dad to bring them some food for, probably as long as mum and dad are willing to put up with it. And a young egret over in the bottom left. And one thing that you find, I guess, when you're kayaking around in some of the egret colonies is those sorts of egrets, the night herons will regurgitate onto you as part of their defense mechanism. So you're often wearing, like the salmon striped frog there is come undone and ended up on someone's kayak. You're often wearing fish and all sorts of mice and a few other critters that don't make it a lot of fun at times, but I think that's just part of their thing. They're trying to maybe lead you off the scent by dropping that stuff in onto you. Maybe you'll eat them less. Anyway, so the numbers for those interested, 90,000 nests we've counted. So we talk in nests. So I guess if you think, there's for everybody except the maybe the magpie geese, there's two adults involved, and generally sort of 1 to 2 young, sometimes 3 young. But yeah, it's a lot of birds. Mostly ibis, 60,000, 30,000 egret, night heron, great egret, with a range of the other species. What we haven't seen this year are any pied herons. So 2016, 2010, there were maybe a half dozen nesting pied herons, which obviously for New South Wales is a big deal. Haven't found them this year. I wouldn't be surprised if they're there, but we just haven't been able to locate them. This colony where they did show up in 2010 and 2016 is moved. So as the vegetation changes, I think these birds just do shack up in different parts of the wetland system. So you'll also find they grow and shrink, fashionable perhaps. Sometimes they'll try new areas, like they did a few new areas this time, sometimes successful, sometimes not, depending on how well they pick those new areas and how the water holds up in them or not. And part of our job is to try and, wherever they shack up, is to try and find the ways to get the water there and keep it there, if possible. There's a royal spoonbill colony, almost pure royal spoonbills, 600 nests. So normally they're sort of smattered across the others, but this one's an interesting just royal spoonbill nests, and a whole range of other sort of critters like the cormorants, the white-necked herons, in amongst them as well. One of the features of this year too is we've got getting new data from the CSIRO. They're satellite tracking a bunch of the adult ibis and some of the royal spoonbills in other catchments of where they're headed. So they've got packs on these ibis. So this is an adult ibis called Han Solo, and he's going over 80 k's each day. He's starting in the left, which is a zoo paddock, one of my colonies in the marshes, and he's travelling all the way sort of to Cumberchance area in the lower sort of Castlereagh catchment just to get a feed and then come back. We don't quite know why he felt the need to want to go that far, but that's what he's been doing, and must be successful. He keeps going back. So yeah, the adults will move in one direction generally to forage far and short, and then keep going until their young are fledged and flying. And even then, they'll feed them for a bit before cutting them loose. And here's an ibis that's finished nesting, Lily. So she would have been an adult, come in, run a nest, and then now she's left and headed to Queensland and all around the place. So there's a number of these birds being tracked now, and you can actually query it on the CSIRO website. I'll provide the link. It's quite interesting where particularly the straw necks are going. And as the technology gets better, they'll be able to track smaller and smaller birds in the same way. The glossy ibis, maybe things like painted snipe. They're already tracking a few Aussie bittens here and there. So this is very interesting data for between nesting events. We do actually do other birds other than just the colonials. So we do spring samples each year for all water birds. And so we're sort of tracking the diversity over time. So you can see in the far right there, last year was sort of 46 species, just above the average of around 41. We track a 3-year rolling average in the black there. 2019 was horrible. There was just one dam in the whole marshes with any couple of ducks on it. I think there was 3 or 4 species, and that's them there. So diversity wise, we're kind of tracking okay. It's the abundance that's probably the thing that we can influence the most at the moment. When we look at the sorts of birds that were showing up last spring in 2021, if you recall, it was still getting pretty wet then. We're getting good, good diversity. The bittens were calling, the snipe about, bluebill ducks plenty about, Brolga and Mampoy geese, and just heaps of little bitten great crested grebe musk ducks, which are kind of notable. They don't always show up out there. So yeah, between the colonial waterbird work and then our regular sort of waterbird sampling, we're trying to keep an eye on what's happening. And here's some critters from last spring, some baby bluebill ducks. You don't see those every day. So yeah, that was very interesting to see. Had to sort of do a bit of a double take when we saw that, and thankfully someone had a good camera, so we got those. So yeah, lots of other waterbirds, breeding non-colonial waterbirds, I guess we could call them. Heaps of ducks, waterfowl, crakes. I think the painted snipe are probably bred up again. The ones we're seeing look a bit teenager-ish, the way they're sort of acting, gathering. Yeah, it's been really a really strong summer for both colonials and non-colonials. I'll provide these links to Aaron, but there is a CSIRO waterbird tracking program. There's a video from December 2020, which might give you more of an inkling of what it's kind of like out there. Fat ducks mean fat cattle, which is one of the sort of some of the rules of thumb of the landholders out there. It's 90% private land, so we spend a lot of time working with landholders, and I'll provide links to my website, Department of Planning Environment, and the Commonwealth orders as well. And I'd just like to acknowledge, the Wildman people of the marshes. Thank those landholders and land managers. Without them, we can't get onto these places. And the great photographers who I hang out with, I'm a very poor photographer, that allow me to bring these sorts of images and stories to you guys, and also the funding to be able to get out there. And that's me.
Oh, thank you, Tim. That was absolutely fascinating. How on earth counting all those creatures. And I really, I quite understand why you can't find those couple of pied herons that might be there and all of that mob. Absolutely amazing.
Sneaky.
Um, I can't see any questions there, Aaron.
Judy, we have Katie Robinson putting her hand up. Katie, I've just asked you to unmute, but please feel free to go ahead and ask your question once you've unmuted.
No, sorry, I was just clapping because I enjoyed the presentation.
Oh, apologies, Katie.
That's all right.
We have a question from Rosemary Stapleton. Tim, what impact do you see the proposed raising of the wall of the Gingin Weir having?
Gingin I think
apologies
the locals will call it, but that's okay. Look, it's designed to increase the reliability of human use. So whenever that happens, that means there's a bit less water for the environment to go around. So whether that's significant or not, I guess that's probably for others to say, but the basin plan has put a cap on how much humans use in all these Murray-Darling Basin areas. So at the end of the day, if humans are going to get more water from that proposal, then there has to be some level of offset. And I know I've been asked a few times by that group, Water Infrastructure New South Wales, what can they do? So until they've sorted that out, it's really hard to say what the actual effect of the proposal will be till they've sort of sorted out the counter proposal, if I can put it that way. But they're working hard and talking to everybody, so that's great. Apart from that, I probably can't say too much because it is a bit uncertain.
Thanks, Rosemary, for the question. Tim, I just wanted to ask quickly, is the CSIRO tracking live tracking, or is it generally delayed by a few days or perhaps a week?
I think it'd be delayed a few days. It's quite thorough, but yeah, I think they sort of do an upload map upload every few days. It's how I believe I get it. I actually get email updates from the team, so I'm usually only checking in every sort of month or two. But have a look on the website. You'd be able to see. But you can be quite detailed in terms of where they're that night, where they are. It's quite the location is quite detailed. We've looked for a few of them, never found them, but one might be shacking up near you.
And Tim, we have a comment from Kim Strong in the chat. She's just wondering if she can contact you afterwards about a project of hers. So I might just direct you to the chat and leave you and Kim to liaise after. Does anyone else have a question for Tim? Please feel free to jump off mute. Otherwise, I'll hand back to Judy.
Thank you, Aaron. You can also address your questions later. If you pop them in chat, we can try and pass them on to you. So once again, Tim, thank you so much. I know my grandchildren will be most impressed with tracking hand solo. I shall have to mention that to them.
Definitely.
Our next speaker with our Wetlands Action is Mal Carnegie from out west as well. He's the projects manager for the Lake Cowal Foundation. It is a not-for-profit environmental trust, and their primary goal is to protect and enhance Lake Cowal, which is a nationally significant wetland out there near West Wyalong. They implement and manage a range of natural resource management initiatives within that catchment, and they deliver environmental education through the Conservation Centre. Wonderful job. Mal will be speaking about the programs being undertaken there at Lake Cowal, the significance of the lake in the Lachlan system, and some more recent breeding events. I thank you, Mal.
Thanks, Judy. I'll just get this up.
Ah, the technology.
So you've got that there?
Yes.
Yeah, we can see that, Mal. I think you're ready to start the slides. Awesome. That looks great.
Yep. Okay. Okay. A lot of what I was going to say is actually very similar to Tim what Tim's presented, particularly in terms of species. And I guess the only exception, I guess, is that Lake Cowal is quite a different habitat type to the marshes. So I'll run through it and try not to double up too much. And what I might do at the end, I'll be probably a little bit quicker because Tim's covered a lot of species already. I might just pop up a little bit of drone video of the very large pelican colony that's out at Lake Brewster. Currently, there's about 30,000 pelicans there. So I'm sure that will be of interest to everyone. Okay, so first up, Lake Cowal, as most of you would know, is positioned centrally between West Wyalong, Forbes and Condobolin in the Lachlan River catchment. And it's New South Wales' largest natural inland lake. And by that, I guess we're meaning that it is not a regulated water, wetland in the sense that most of our other wetlands are. So Lake Cowal itself covers a bit over 13,000 hectares. It is an ephemeral system, like all of these inland wetlands were prior to regulation. Just to the north and adjoining Lake Cowal is Nerang Cowal, which is another 4,500 hectares. So Lake Cowal has a maximum depth of about 3.5 metres, whereas Nerang Cowal is about 1.6, 1.7 metres. So it dries out usually within the first summer of filling, whereas Lake Cowal will last 3 summers. Prior to the flooding, which we experienced on the Lachlan in 2021 and early 22, Lake Cowal had up to 40% surface area covered for the 2019 and 20 summer. And as a consequence of that, and everywhere else being quite dry, we had huge numbers of birds. I think we had 65 different species at that time, and there was it was particularly abundant with shorebirds, waders, etc. So, you know, coming forward to 21, 22, we were looking at probably 125, 130% capacity, so a very different scenario in terms of habitat and completely different makeup of bird species. Nesting, breeding is very different as well. So we haven't seen any or many shorebirds and waders at all over this spring-summer period. Similar species to suite of species to what Tim's described in the Macquarie Marshes. So at present, the lake has drawn down to just on 100%, and with no further inflows, we'll have water through till February 2024, it should be, not 23. The lake itself is predominantly private property, except for 2 small public reserves. So access is a little bit of an issue for birders wanting to get a look at what's going on over the majority of the area. There's the biggest public reserves located on the southern end. It's about 120 odd hectares. And then there's a smaller, narrow one up on the western side, it's only about 20 hectares. It's very narrow, so it's sort of limited access. So you nearly need a boat or a kayak or something to get on the water to get a good look around. Yeah, so the lake itself, being privately owned, It is opportunistically cropped and grazed when dry or drying. And you can see in this slide that what it looks like when it's dry, just as it's dried out. This was February 2019. And then the bottom right-hand corner, it does have fence lines running through it. There's a fence line that runs pretty much north-south down the centre of the lake, and all of the blocks are fenced out from that. And you can see that far right-hand side, you've got cropping there that's going to be flooded out during 2020. Okay. So some of the other features of the lake itself, in the northern end, which is the shallower end, we've got an area of about 750 hectares of lignum. This represents only a third of the lignum area that used to be in Lake Cowal. So during the millennium drought, the lake was completely dry for 9 years. So from the summer of 2000, 2001, right through to March 2010. During 2008, a block of 1,800 hectares of lignum, which was the main bird breeding area, in slightly shallower water than the current lignum block. Yeah, it was burnt during February of 2008. So that was a very major, a step change for the bird breeding habitat of Lake Cowal. Other features in terms of habitat, along the southern and western shoreline, there's a 1 kilometre wide stand of cane grass, which is utilised by numerous bird species, obviously for feeding and also for nesting. So we get the magpie geese nesting in that, as well as whiskered terns, those sorts of birds. Throughout the broader area, there are 277 bird species recorded, including 180 waterbird species. The region around Lake Cowal, there are 9 distinguishable vegetation communities, so it's quite a diverse area, and hence we've got that large number of bird species recorded in the broader area. And you can see there in that slide what the cane grass habitat looks like, and then in the background there you can see the fringing river red gums. Similar to what Tim was showing you, we had large numbers of all 3 ibis species nesting in the lake throughout this past summer. We had two major floods come down the Lachlan during that breeding time, and the first cohort of straw-necked ibis, probably about 85% of them were lost to the flood. So this lignum, you can see that the water is up quite high in the lignum itself. Those nests were actually flooded out probably about a fortnight after I'd taken this shot with the drone. So that equated to about 4,000 nests being lost in the first instance. When the second flood came in, the losses were slightly less in terms of percentage, but by that stage the colony had grown to some 25 odd hectares. So you know, if you extrapolate that out, it's probably a loss of another sort of 6,000 to 8,000 nests. Following on from that, which was quite surprising to us, the colony continued to build and ended up covering an area of about 150 hectares. And we're still just, we've been working with the University of New South Wales to determine just how many nests that actually equates to. It was very difficult to determine because the water level was so high. The nesting density was very different to what we would ordinarily experience and what we'd experienced prior, you know, in 2010, 2012 and 2017. I've just got a video here and I'm not sure if it's going to play for me or not. Just to give you an idea of what goes on in these colonies in case none of you have experienced it before. So this particular section of video is taken around about sort of 10:30 in the morning, I guess, and I picked this one because that sort of time of the day tends to be when the adult birds are coming back in to feed the chicks, and you can see there's a lot of aerial activity in the background, and the sky does get blacked out by the birds coming in. That bird that's moving around a lot on top of the lignum, if you look just below it to the right, you'll see some blue eggs there that belong to a glossy ibis. So they do tend to mingle in amongst the straw necks. So in terms of the glossy and the white ibis, well, I'll start with the straw neck. So we're thinking around 25,000 nests over that 150 hectares of lignum, around about 1,000 Australian white ibis nests, 600 odd glossy ibis nests. Now, the glossy ibis actually nested twice over the spring-summer period and successfully fledged twice. So they tend to nest a little bit higher than the straw neck and the white ibis. We also had about 500 royal spoonbill nests, little black cormorants. We had a 13-hectare area where we're estimating there are around 1,200 little black cormorants nesting there. Nankeen night herons, around about 300 nests. So in comparison to Macquarie Marshes, quite a lot smaller, but then if you factor in the loss of that 1,800 hectares of lignum, then you can see why we're in the situation we're in terms of the availability of breeding habitat for these birds. Similarly to Macquarie Marshes, we have all three species of egrets breeding in various areas, but only in relatively small numbers. When we had the high numbers of birds during the 2019-20 period, we had huge numbers of all major species of ducks breeding on the lake then. Whereas this time around with the higher water level, we didn't see much of that duck breeding at all. Apart from bluebill duck, there were noticeable higher numbers, and also some freckled duck. I'm just going to flick through a few slides here just to give you a bit of an idea of what we've been seeing over the summer. One thing we've noticed with the magpie geese over the last 3 sort of major breeding years that we've had, starting in 2010, the magpie goose numbers are increasing year on year, as is the breeding. So they seem to be starting to favour these southern inland areas for increasing their breeding activity. Nankeen night herons, we had so many sightings reported to us this year. and everyone is reporting Australasian bitterns everywhere. Obviously mistaking the young ones for a bittern, so that we've been experiencing huge numbers of sightings of Australasian bittern, and much to the disappointment of the people. We're having to let them know that they're seeing young night herons, and Warren Chad or Chatty in Condobolins reporting the same, and similarly from the birdos in Lake Angelico. Some of the cormorants, young cormorants, little pied cormorants as well, not in great numbers, similar to what Tim's saying. Mostly little blacks of great cormorants. Great crested grebe, probably in larger numbers than we've ever recorded, right around the perimeter of the lake. And it looks to us like they've had two generations of breeding there as well, similar to most of the other species. Royal spoonbills, as I was saying, we've had around about 500 nests in the Lignum area, and that's probably close to double what we've seen prior.
Sorry, Mal, I think we might have
So
timed that well.
Aaron, are you happy for me to put that?
Yeah, yep.
Okay.
I think we timed that well, Mal. I think we just started to lose you towards the end, but thank you very much. That was excellent. I might just hand over to Judy. I'm not sure if we'll be able to do questions if Mal's internet starts to cut out. But Mal, if you're okay, keep an eye on the chat, and if any questions pop up, please feel free to type replies. Thank you, everyone. Judy, we might move on to Alan Stewart's presentation.
Thank you, Mal. Once again, absolutely fascinating. But the Dalek voice, your voice, started to sound like at the end. That's what I'm used to at my home as well. We just have to, thank goodness it works so well. And so interesting, the changing manner of those wetlands, just amazing. Our next speaker, returning to the coast, returning to the Hunter area, is Alan Stuart. Very much involved for many years with the long-term studies of the Hunter wetlands. He'll be speaking about the monitoring of the shorebird and waterbird populations in the Hunter River and what he's revealed. Alan is actually travelling, and he's given us his pre-recorded presentation. I've actually enjoyed this presentation at the Ornithological Conference, which was on, not in New Zealand, virtual again, and a very interesting talk. And I'm particularly interested in one of the issues is, again, like in some of one of our projects closer to Sydney, with mangrove management. So thank you, Aaron. He's managing Alan's presentation.
Today, I will talk about the Hunter Estuary in New South Wales, and in particular, how various habitat changes have affected the local populations of shorebirds and waterbirds. So here's where the Hunter Estuary is located. Historically, there have been several bursts of survey effort, each of them spanning a few years, and then a longish gap before someone else had a go. In 1999, we decided to get serious, and there have been systematic surveys every month since then. We've only missed twice, once because of really bad weather in 2007, and this year once because of the pandemic. Our driver for getting started was to monitor shorebirds. That's still the main aim, and so we do the surveys on a high tide, and we go to all the known shorebird roost sites. We now go out in 6 teams to do that. It's a big estuary. We count all the waterbirds that we see, and we now have a long-term database which allows us to examine seasonal and longer-term trends and the effects of habitat changes, which is what I'll be talking about today. So the 20th century saw almost constant losses of habitat for shorebirds and waterbirds for a range of reasons. As I've put on the slide here, I won't read them all out. Mostly that's all in the past, but this century has seen the closure of an important roost site at a sewage works, and we still have one important area which is earmarked for an infrastructure corridor. There have been two other negatives. One was an oil spill in Newcastle Harbour. Apparently most of it was contained, but there were oiled birds being seen, and we don't know if there are any long-term impacts. Of much more significance, we think, is that the main feeding area for many shorebirds at Fullerton Cove has suffered many decades of contamination from firefighting chemicals used at the local airport. I'll come back to that later. On the positive side of things, firstly, two things happened by accident. Dredge spoil from the construction of Stockton Bridge over the Hunter River created a very large sand spit, which has become a foraging and roosting site. And the Kooragang dikes were built. Originally, the idea was to put factories behind them. They quickly became a very important roost site. In modern times, both of these accidental pieces of habitat are included into the national park, and there are monitoring programs to look after them. The biggest change this century has been to restore tidal flushing at 3 sites within the estuary. This has regenerated more than 1,500 hectares of tidal wetlands, which formerly had become a mix of grasslands and freshwater wetlands, mostly ephemeral ones. And about 90% now of all the important areas are included into the Hunter Wetlands National Park, which is quite pleasing. Another positive development is that there's now a wide acceptance of the notion that mangroves should be controlled at targeted sites. As a result, there's been a large increase in the amount of salt marsh in the estuary, getting back to what it used to be. So let's look at what's been the effect of some of these changes on bird populations. So firstly, with shorebirds, so most of the endemic shorebirds have stable or increasing populations. These two graphs here are box and whisker plots for pied stilt and masked lapwing. They're divided into 3 approximately equal time frames: 7 years, 7 years, 8 years. I know the scales are hard to see, but the trends are very clear. So the stilt numbers went down a bit after the millennium drought broke, but they've now about doubled. That's from a combination of another inland drought plus the new wetlands in the estuary. And you can also see how the lapwings have kicked along. Avocets deserve a special mention. They disappear when there's been good rain inland, but for much of the time there are thousands of them in the estuary. It's common to have 5 or so thousand of them, and occasionally there have been more than 7,000 birds. For migratory shorebirds, it is a different story. Most of them are experiencing major declines. So here are the graphs for bar-tailed bobwhit and far eastern curlew as just 2 examples. Again, in the 3 time periods, each of those changes is statistically highly significant. These declines have been happening since the late 1980s. A study done by Rob Clemens and co-workers has shown that the declines in the Hunter Estuary are larger for migratory shorebirds than at any other site in Australia. The 2 standout exceptions have been sharp-tailed sandpiper and Pacific golden plover. You can see in their box and whisker plots, the plovers have been increasing quite steadily, and their numbers are now back to about what used to be present in the 1980s. For the Sharpies, the big increases were in the period 2013 to 2019, coinciding with inland drought plus the newly restored wetlands. So in those years, we had large numbers, 1,000 or more birds visiting every year and peaking at more than 6,000 birds. An important point to note is that the plovers and the Sharpies don't feed in Fullerton Cove, whereas all the migratory shorebirds that are in decline, that is where they feed. For gulls and tern species, the notable finding was that silver gull numbers had halved from roughly 2010. This box and whiskers plot shows the results for each season from 2 successive 11-year periods. So we go summer, autumn, winter and spring. These changes seem to be linked with how the local waste management centre is operated, and particularly that they now cover the rubbish piles, and that limits the scavenging opportunities for silver gulls. So we've got 3 tern species with increasing populations: goldbill tern, Catherine tern, whisker tern. They seem to have benefited from the newly restored wetlands. 2 species with decreasing populations, white-winged black tern and common tern. They are both migrate within the flyway, and we think perhaps we're seeing external factors applying for them. The little tern also is a migrant. Its numbers did decline in the from the late 1980s onwards, but that situation seems to have stabilised now, and they seem to have benefited from changed management practices on the beaches to the north of Newcastle, along Newcastle Bight and the Warramai conservation lands, and that seems to have led to better breeding success for them. For small water birds, ducks, etc., the story is a positive one. We're not seeing any species with decreasing populations, although for some, like pink-eared duck and the shoveler and hoary-headed grebe, the numbers fluctuate a lot depending on what's happening inland. That's probably also the case for the crakes. We just don't really get enough records of them to get data to look for trends. But for all the species where we can examine trends, many of them, as listed on this slide, have experienced population growth, and the changes are statistically significant. Sometimes there's a seasonal aspect to that, and I mentioned that chestnut teal, as the box and whiskers plot found for chestnut teal for 4 seasons, 2 successive 11-year periods. They're mostly here in summer and autumn, and in autumn we often get quite large numbers of them, and more than 1,000 birds many times, which is 1% of the population, and we've peaked at nearly 4,000 birds. And for the large water birds, again, it's almost entirely good news. Most species have increasing populations. In fact, we couldn't prove that any had declined. The Australasian bitterns might have lost a bit of habitat, but they also might have got some other habitat back. And there's a bit of uncertainty about what's happening with some of the egrets, but for everything else, it's been very positive. And the big winner has been the black-necked stork. That used to be a rare species in the estuary with just occasional sightings of a single bird. But since 2013, when the tidal flows became regular and reliable, storks have been recorded regularly, and we now know for sure that there are 2 breeding pairs in the estuary. It's been a wonderful success story. So to sum up, well, firstly, 3 main points. A lot of waterbird and shorebird species have benefited from the restoration of tidal flushing into the estuary. The estuary's role as a drought refuge for certain inland species is very clear. Sharp-tailed sandpipers as a standout example, but also other species such as red-kneed dotterel. And we are concerned about the state of Fullerton Cove and whether the food supply has been affected and whether that's impacting on shorebirds. And from closing remarks, this has been citizen science at about its best. Lots of people, lots of enthusiasm, a long-term study which is ongoing. We've worked very closely with the local land managers, and the foresight to restore tidal flushing came from them. We put all our data into the national database, and it's obviously important to do that, but we also think it's important that there be local interpretations made by people who understand the local context. So perhaps there's a role for national bird organisations to facilitate that local interpretations happen. Thank you for listening.